Thanks, Carolyn, and good evening, everyone. I want to begin, as we always do, with an acknowledgement of country. But I have been challenged earlier today by Julian to make an acknowledgement that is meaningful and truthful. So to respond to that challenge, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet this evening, the Wadandi people. But I would also like to acknowledge the dispossession experienced by those people through loss of land and family and language. I want to acknowledge also the need for a commitment by all of us to reconcile with our First Nations people. And I want also to pay my respects to Wadandi elders past and present. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to ECU's Southwest Campus. I particularly recognise that we have Councillor McCleary with us here this evening, so welcome Betty and thanks for coming. We're very proud of the facilities that we provide on this campus for our students and for the community. You would have noticed when you arrived that this building is being refurbished. Now that refurbishment is providing greater accessibility to this building, and a redesign of learning spaces are providing for a greater use of interactive technology and collaborative learning approaches. And in terms of accessibility, we've actually installed a lift to the side of the building so that there's access to the theatre. So I think you can see from the investment just being made in this building that ECU has a strong commitment to providing accessible educational opportunities. That's what we like to see that we're about. We have a strong commitment also to engaging with the community to discuss issues of social importance. And I thank you all for coming this evening to be part of our community conversations. And of course we're very honoured to have Julian Burnside here this evening to lead this conversation. This is the final in a series of community conversations that we've had, and we're using this series of events to celebrate 20 years of social work education at ECU Southwest Campus. We're very proud of our social work program here at the Southwest Campus. Our undergraduate program continues to grow, and the research that our social work academics are engaged in has strong links with the community. So I hope you all enjoy this evening.
So it's my privilege to introduce Julian Burnside and give you a little bit of background. I mean, many of you will know his history and his contribution. Julian is based in Melbourne. He's a barrister who specialises in commercial litigation, and he joined the bar in 1976 and took silk in 1989. He's acted for the Octeti Natives against BHP, for Alan Bond in fraud trials, for Rose Porteous in numerous actions against Reinhardt, and for the Maritime Union of Australia in the 1998 waterfront dispute against Patrick Stevedores. He was Senior Counsel assisting the Australian Broadcasting Authority in the Cash for Comment inquiry, and was Senior Counsel for Liberty Victoria in the Tampa litigation. So we can see why we all know his name so well. Julian is passionately involved in the arts and collects contemporary paintings and sculptures and regularly commissions music. He's chair of 45 Downstairs, a not-for-profit arts and performance venue in Flinders Lane, Melbourne, and chair of Chamber Music Australia. He's an author, and in 2004 he wrote a book of essays on language and etymology called Word Watching. In 2007, a collection of his essays and speeches about the justice system and human rights were published in a book titled Watching Brief. Julian has also compiled a book of letters written by asylum seekers held in Australia's detention camps. The book, From Nothing to Zero, was published in 2003 by Lonely Planet. He also wrote Matilda and the Dragon, a children's book published by Allen and Unwin in 1991. So you can imagine what an interesting conversation we all had earlier this afternoon when we were talking and meeting with Julian for the first time. In 2004, Julian was elected as a living national leader. In 2009, he was made an Officer of the Order of Australia, and in 2014, he was awarded the Sydney Peace Prize, another honour many of us would love to have. As a former President of Liberty Victoria, Julian has acted pro bono in many human rights cases, in particular concerning the treatment of refugees. And tonight he will deliver a lecture titled, Why Should We Care About Refugees? So please join me in welcoming the notable Australian Julian Burnside, AOQC.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm conscious this is meant to be a community conversation, and so I really hope that when we get to the question and answer session, you'll take me on, because there's no point all of us just agreeing with each other, although I want to persuade you to agree with me. But I particularly welcome questions from people who don't agree with me. So the question is, why should we care about refugees? And I hope to persuade you that we should care about refugees. And the primary argument, I think, is the way we behave defines us. It is a very important idea. The way we behave defines us. It is true in every aspect of our lives. The way we behave defines who we are. And while I got involved in the refugee issue initially because I was troubled about people being treated badly, it's now become a sort of existential problem. It is a question about what sort of country we are. And all of us should worry about that, because I happen to think this is a really great country and we're behaving way worse than we should. So let me talk about a few things that we've been doing. First of all, indefinite mandatory detention. Many of you will be aware that if a person comes to Australia without a visa, they are subject to indefinite mandatory detention. That is a shorthand way of expressing what is found in, I think it's section 189 of the Migration Act, which says that if a person is a non-citizen and does not have a visa, they must be detained and remain in detention until they get a visa or until they're removed from Australia. What does that mean in practice? What it means in practice was tested in the High Court in, I think, 2003 or 4. There was a refugee who'd come to Australia as a boat person, so he just turns up asking for a safe place to live. I call them boat people because it's an easy expression, but these are people who are asking for protection from persecution. So he comes here and he's put in detention because he's a non-citizen and he doesn't have a visa. His initial application for a visa was knocked back. He could have appealed. On appeal, he would almost certainly have succeeded, but it would have meant another few months at least in detention. At this point, he was in Woomera Detention Centre in the South Australian desert, and he couldn't stand it. So instead of delaying his time in detention longer, he simply said to the Australian government, remove me from Australia. I'll sign any documents you need, just send me out of here. But they couldn't. He's a stateless Palestinian. There was nowhere they could send him. The Howard government argued all the way to the High Court that that man, who has committed no offence, who is not regarded as a risk to anyone, he can stay in detention for the rest of his life. That was their argument. And by a majority of 4-3, the High Court said that's what the Migration Act means, and with that meaning it's constitutionally valid. Think about that. An innocent human being can be put in detention for the rest of his life if he can't be booted out of the country. Now, by contrast, a couple of years later, there was the English Parliament passed an act which said that if a person was a refugee, in brackets, they can't be removed from England, and if they are a suspected terrorist, they can be detained for up to 12 months. And this was, quote unquote, to protect the life of the nation, or preserve the life of the nation. And that little qualification was important because England, as a member of the EU, or Britain as a member of the EU, has got domestic legislation, the Human Rights Act, which mirrors the protections of the European Charter of Human Rights. It's a condition of entry to the EU that you have domestic legislation that reflects the Charter of Human Rights. And in the Human Rights Act in Britain, there is a get-out clause. The Parliament can't do things which are prohibited by the Human Rights Act unless it is to preserve the life of the nation. That's the get-out clause. So, normally speaking, they could not pass an act which says that a person can simply be thrown in detention without having been charged or tried for any offence, but to preserve the life of the nation. If you're a refugee who can't be removed and you're a suspected terrorist, you can be put in detention for up to 12 months. So the question goes to the House of Lords, is this valid or not? And by a majority of 8-1, the English House of Lords said, no, it is not valid. And one of the law lords, Lord Hoffman, who in some respects was quite a conservative law lord, said that the life of the nation is less threatened by terrorism than by laws like these. It's a very, very powerful idea. The idea that you can detain innocent human beings for up to 12 months was regarded as unacceptable in Great Britain. We need to think about that because we derive most of our legal ideas from Great Britain. A country which derives many of its ideas from us is Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea has recently been used, as you know, to detain boat people who've come to Australia and get taken by force against their will to Papua New Guinea, specifically Manus Island, or to Nauru, which is a separate independent republic in the Pacific. The Supreme Court of Papua New Guinea decided a couple of years ago that the detention of asylum seekers who have committed no offence, the detention of asylum seekers was inconsistent with their constitutional Bill of Rights. Okay, so reflect on this. Australia's conduct falls short of the human rights standards of Papua New Guinea, who derived their constitution from us, and we fall way short of the human rights standards of Great Britain, from whom we get our ideas about the system of law. Now, I've a couple of times said that asylum seekers haven't committed any offence, and it's really, really important to know that because from the time of Tampa, the Australian government has constantly called boat people illegals. And that creates the impression that they have committed an offence. It's not true. Okay? They commit no offence by coming to Australia without a visa, without an invitation, and asking for protection. On the contrary, not only do they not commit an offence by doing that, they're giving effect to a right which we recognised on their behalf when we played a leading role in the formulation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the great Eleanor Roosevelt's great project from 1947-48. Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in which Australia played a major role, considering its tiny population at the time, the Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that every person has the right to seek asylum in any country they can reach. Now, Australia helped contribute to that provision, and of course, it was an Australian, Doc Evatt, who presided over the General Assembly on the 10th of December 1948 when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the world community. Unhappily, we seem to have forgotten that fundamental point, that every human being has the right to seek asylum because if they come here seeking asylum, we call them illegal, and then we lock them up and treat them like criminals. And we treat them harshly. The harshness of their treatment is breathtaking. My first lesson in this came not long after I was involved in the Tampa case. By the way, the Tampa case is important. Some of you will remember the Tampa case, others of you are too young to remember, or so old as to have forgotten. I should be careful saying things like that. The Tampa case, the Tampa was a Norwegian cargo ship, which was contacted by Australia because Australia was aware that a boatload of Afghan Hazara refugee applicants was heading towards Australia but had begun falling apart in the Indian Ocean. And Australia contacted the Tampa and said, look, it's in your area, can you rescue them? The captain of the Tampa found this little boat, the Palapa, which was sinking in the Indian Ocean. His assessment was that it could carry maybe 50 people, and he was astounded when 438 people walked up the rope ladder, up the side of the Tampa onto the decks. Now, some of the people were in a poor state of health. There were pregnant women, there were people who'd fallen into unconsciousness. So it's very difficult for him. But he had an added difficulty, which was that the Tampa was licensed to carry 50 people. It had a crew of 47, and suddenly 438 unexpected passengers. And so he headed towards Christmas Island and was told by Australia, you are forbidden to enter Australian territorial waters off Christmas Island. He defied them. Howard sent out the SAS, who took control of the bridge at gunpoint, and then there was a standoff. And here are these poor buggers sitting on the steel decks of a ship in the tropical sun for day after day. And eventually a group of us went to the federal court to see if we could sort it out. And the judgment of Justice North in the federal court was handed down in Melbourne at 2:15 in the afternoon on the 11th of September 2001, just 8 hours before the attack on America. And all of a sudden, across the West, you no longer had terrorists, you only had Muslim terrorists. And because all the terrorists were Muslim, all Muslims became terrorists. The flaw in the logic is so obvious as not to need explanation. And that's when the Howard government started calling boat people illegal. And during the course of the Tampa litigation, they cobbled together the Pacific solution. Rather unhappy expression, but I guess they were working in a hurry. And we've had the Pacific solution then since that time. Now, not long after the Tampa case, I got involved in another matter. This concerned an Iranian family, not Muslim, by the way, but treated as if they were. They are, in fact, members of a pre-Christian sect regarded in Iran as unclean, who suffer the consequences of being judged unclean. It was mum and dad and 2 daughters. At the relevant time, the daughters were 11 and 7. They fled Iran late one night in terrible circumstances, ended up in Australia, got banged up in Woomera Detention Centre, and after about 15 or 18 months, they were all in a really bad way, because it takes about 18 months to break people down in our detention system. But the 11-year-old girl was in a really, really bad way. So bad that a psychiatrist from either Adelaide or Sydney, I can't remember which, went to Woomera to check on the kid, spoke to her, spoke to the parents, delivered a psych report to the Department of Immigration, which was devastating. And it said that she was at extreme risk. She needed daily psychiatric help. And back then in Woomera, which was grossly overcrowded, if you had serious psychiatric needs, you would get to see the visiting psychiatrist roughly once every 6 months. She needed daily psychiatric help, and so this psychiatrist recommended that the family be moved to a metropolitan detention centre where she could get daily psychiatric help. So they moved the family from Woomera in the South Australian desert to Maribyrnong in the western suburbs of Melbourne. And there, although the reason for moving them was that little Martab needed daily psychiatric help, for the first few weeks of their stay in Maribyrnong, nobody came to see her. Not a psychiatrist, not a doctor, not a nurse, not a social worker, nobody. And on a Sunday night, in, I think, May of 2002, while her mum and dad and young sister were off in the mess hall having dinner, Martab, alone in their cell, took a bedsheet and hanged herself. But she didn't know how to tie the knot properly, and she was still strangling when the family came back. And she and her mother were taken to the general hospital nearby with 2 ACM guards, so that as a matter of legal analysis, they were still in immigration detention because they're accompanied by officers of the Commonwealth. And Con Karapanagiotidis, who founded the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre and was looking after their refugee application, he heard about this and went to the hospital at about 9:30 that night. And he said good day to the guards, who know him well because he's a regular visitor at Maribyrnong. He said, I just want to speak to the mother to see if there's anything I can do to help. And the guards said to him, no, you can't see them because lawyers' visiting hours in immigration detention are 9 to 5. And they sent him away. He then rang me at home, and still 16 years later, I still cannot get over the sense of anger that we could drive a kid to try and kill herself and then turn away someone who is just offering ordinary, human, decent help. That case, I think, sort of tipped me over some kind of edge. Anyway, then, later on, that little girl, she was in the child and adolescent mental health unit at the Austin Hospital for 12 months until she was assessed as well enough to be put back in detention. Think about that. Think about that. Some years later, I did a thing for a guy called Amin. Amin Mustapur and his 8-year-old daughter were in Baxter Detention Centre. Baxter Detention Centre, designed and built for the Howard government, was described by Philip Ruddock as the family-friendly detention centre. Think about that, a family-friendly detention centre, good God. There was a funny story about that because not long before Baxter opened, I had been invited to take part in a panel session about asylum seekers in South Australia. And I knew that one of the other members of the panel was going to be a woman called Philippa Godwin, who was then a Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration in charge of the Lock 'em Up section. And as it happens, a ground plan of the soon-to-be-open Baxter Detention Centre fell off the back of a truck and landed on my desk. And I was interested to see that the 5,000-volt electric fence around the outside was described on the plan as a courtesy fence. So, in the public meeting, I looked at Philippa Godwin and I said, why is it that the ground plan describes the electric fence as a courtesy fence? And she looked at me coldly and said, it's not an electric fence, it's an energised fence. That gives you something of the mentality of the people who run the Lock 'em Up section. Anyway, Amin and his daughter were in Baxter, the family-friendly detention centre with the courtesy fence. And one day, they were in their room and 5 ACM guards walked in and ordered him to strip because they thought he had a cigarette lighter. Okay, so they order him to strip. He refuses because not only is it culturally wrong for a Muslim man to be naked in front of other people, his 8-year-old daughter was in the room. And so he refused. They roughed him up, handcuffed him, and dragged him off to the management unit. The management unit at Baxter, purpose designed and built for the Howard government, the management unit was a series of solitary confinement cells, each measuring 2.5 metres square, each with bare surfaces, bare walls, bare floors, all of that. The only furnishings in the rooms are a mattress on the floor. And the person in the room has no company because they're in isolation and no privacy because they are video monitored 24 hours a day. And for that purpose, the lights are left on 24 hours a day. They're not allowed anything to read, anything to write with. There's no TV, no radio, no CD player, nothing. But they are allowed half an hour of exercise in each 24 or a visit for half an hour in each 24 hours. So Amin was allowed a half-hour visit each day from his daughter. And after about 2 weeks in solitary, Amin got very upset because his daughter didn't come for her visit. And he complained to the manager of the detention centre, a bloke employed by the immigration department, and the guy explained to Amin that the daughter had been taken shopping in Port Augusta and she'd be there the next day. Well, the next day came and went, and the daughter didn't arrive for a visit. And the manager, who had given the promise the day before, came into Armin's cell and said to him, "Your daughter is now back in Tehran. If you want to see her again, you should abandon your claim for protection and return to Iran voluntarily." Now, at first he thought it was some kind of sick practical joke. But when he was persuaded it was true, he had a complete nervous breakdown and remained in solitary confinement for the next 7 weeks, until even the government's own psychiatrist said, "This man is being killed by what you're doing. You cannot keep him locked up." They ignored that advice. When we became aware of his circumstances, we went to court to get an order that he be removed from solitary. And the department's argument before a single judge of the federal court was, "You, the judge, cannot tell us how to treat people in immigration detention. There are lots and lots of rules about how people are treated in the prison system, but there are no rules about how they can be treated in immigration detention. People who've not been found guilty of any offence, people who haven't committed an offence, they can be treated however you want." That was the government's argument. I'm glad to say that the judge did not agree, and not only was he removed from solitary, he was ordered to be moved to a different detention centre, so he wouldn't have to deal each day with the people who'd treated him that way. Then, let's go back a step. Before the ring of steel went up around the northwest, and we had only the moat to make it difficult for people to get here, people would typically arrive at Christmas Island. Now, I had a conversation with a doctor who'd worked on Christmas Island for IHMS, International Health and Medical Services, who provide all the medical services for people in the detention system. And this doctor was telling me that when people arrive, boat people have typically come from landlocked countries. They've typically never seen the ocean before. They've typically never been on the ocean before. They've typically had about 7 days at sea, typically in very uncomfortable circumstances, typically with not enough to eat and drink, and typically they've had no opportunity to wash or change their clothes. They typically arrive in clothing caked with their own excrement, and the Department of Immigration interviews them before they are allowed to wash or change. A little humiliation to give them a warning of what's to come. Back then, and this was a few years ago, back then they would be interviewed to see whether there was any reason that they couldn't be sent offshore. If they had any medication with them, it was taken and destroyed. And according to this doctor, there was one person whose job it was to sit in front of a bin popping pills out of blister packs for later destruction. If they had any medical documentation, it was taken from them and destroyed. If they had medical prostheses, such as false limbs, spectacles, hearing aids and so on, they were taken and not returned. So they're assessed to see whether there's any reason why they can't be sent to offshore detention. And she told me of one woman who had been kept on Christmas Island in detention for some weeks because it was thought she was insane. But because they've thrown away all the medication and the medical documentation, they don't know why she's insane. What's the nature of her insanity? And so the doctor decided to have a lengthy consultation to find out what was going on. And she said it was a very difficult consultation because she and the patient didn't have any language in common. The interpreter was in Sydney, 4,000 miles away at the end of a phone. So it was a difficult consultation, but she eventually worked out the problem. The problem was this woman was incontinent of urine, and she couldn't leave her cabin without having urine running down her leg, and it was driving her mad. So the doctor told immigration, "We need incontinence pads for this lady." Their first response was, "We don't do those." The doctor insisted. So they said, "All right, well, she can have 4 per day." Not enough. They said more than 4 would be a fire hazard. So that's the way they were treated on Christmas Island. And then, if possible, they were shunted off to Nauru or Manus. Manus is an island, part of Papua New Guinea, north of Port Moresby, almost on the equator, and it's very small. And Australia has had a base there since the Second World War, which is why they were able to use it. Nauru is an independent republic in the Central Pacific, also very close to the equator. Nauru is interesting because, you know, little tiny crowded Australia can't take these boat people, but Nauru can, because Nauru's land area is smaller than Tullamarine Airport in Melbourne. Really. It's 2 square kilometres smaller than Tullamarine Airport. It's got a population of about 10,000 people and no recognisable gross domestic product. It has not an adequate water supply for its own people. It doesn't have any natural food supply for its own people. Everything gets shipped in. It's a very unhappy place. Now, things get worse and worse on Nauru. You need to remember that the Pacific solution had 2 phases, 2001 when it was formulated through to about 2006, give or take, and the people who remained there were brought to Australia. They're now, many of them, Australian citizens. Then in 2012, Julia Gillard's government reignited the Pacific solution, largely in response to the taunting of Tony Abbott from opposition, and it became even harsher under Kevin Rudd. And since 2013, every person arriving in Australia seeking a protection has been taken by force against their will to Manus or Nauru. Now, just so you feel proud of this country, let me tell you what the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has said about us and Manus and Nauru. This was their report in 2016. 88% of asylum seekers and refugees assessed were suffering from a depressive or anxiety disorder and or post-traumatic stress disorder. It appears that PTSD and depression have reached epidemic proportions. UNHCR anticipates that mental illness, distress and suicide will continue to escalate in the immediate and foreseeable future. Physical conditions in the Manus camp are similarly alarming. Inspectors found unusable toilets, broken washing machines, dilapidated gym equipment and serious overcrowding. They observed, quote, conditions at the Lombrum Regional Processing Centre that are the equivalent to a maximum security prison in Australia, yet without appropriate safeguards in place. The dwellings in Delta and Oscar compounds, this is in Manus, currently provide approximately 1.6 square metres per person, which is half the minimum international standard for prisons. The risk to public health and mental health of such overcrowding are considerable. The report went on to say, to refer to the indifference of Broad Spectrum, formerly Transfield, and Wilson Security staff to allegations of sexual assault. Staff members simply brushed off allegations of rape as unsubstantiated and did not appreciate the serious welfare concerns for victims. This is highly concerning. Okay, so that's the UNHCR's observations about us less than a year ago. The treatment of people, there's more from the UNHCR. This was 24 July this year, 24 July 2017. Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. His press release is headed, Australia must end harmful practice of offshore processing. It's called offshore processing. Never ever forget that Kevin Rudd at the start and subsequent Prime Ministers since him said people sent offshore for processing will never be allowed to come to Australia. Not even if they are resettled in America, highly unlikely, or Canada, a bit more likely, and become citizens of those places, they will not be allowed to come here as tourists. Filippo Grandi said, Australia's policy of offshore processing in PNG and Nauru, which denies access to asylum in Australia for refugees arriving by sea without a visa, has caused extensive avoidable suffering for far too long. In light of this dire humanitarian situation, I can skip that. UNHCR has recently been informed by Australia that it refuses to accept even those refugees who have family living in Australia, along with the others on Nauru and PNG, that have been informed that their only option is to remain where they are or be transferred to Cambodia or to the United States. Well, Cambodia, remember, 4 people were sent to Cambodia. We paid Cambodia $55 million to take them. All but one of them have left Cambodia since they were sent there. The United States seems to have made a vague arrangement, but you'll all remember reading the transcript of the telephone conversation between Donald Trump and Malcolm Turnbull, in which Turnbull effectively said, look, all you have to do is assess them, maybe you won't take any, whatever, up to you. Unbelievable. Filippo Grandi went on to say about the fact that they will not be allowed to come to Australia. This means, for example, that some with serious mental conditions or who've undergone traumatic experiences, including sexual violence, cannot receive the support of their close family members living in Australia. There is no doubt these vulnerable people, already subject to 4 years of punishing conditions, should be reunited with their families in Australia. This is the humane and reasonable thing to do. Well, I think that's pretty obvious. The Australian government's decision to deny them this possibility is contrary to the fundamental principles of family unity and refugee protection and to common decency. Are you proud of how we're doing? You know, I think we need to do a bit better. UNHCR fully endorses the need to save lives at sea and to provide alternatives to dangerous journeys and exploitation by smugglers. But the practice of offshore processing has had a hugely detrimental impact. There is a fundamental contradiction in saving people at sea only to mistreat and neglect them on land. That is true. Now think about this. Our politicians say, and frankly I think they're lying, but they say they're very worried about unscrupulous people smugglers who put people's lives at risk at sea. They say they're worried about the 1,200 who drowned, although when in opposition, the Liberal Party seemed to crow every time there were drownings reported because that was politically good for them. But here's the crunch. They are so worried about people drowning that if they don't drown, they punish them. Try and figure that out. And then you'll remember, I think the political logic of this was captured beautifully by Cathy Wilcox, great cartoonist. Cathy Wilcox, you remember a couple of years ago, 2 years ago I think, a man self-immolated on Nauru. Omid Masumali and his family had been assessed by the Nauruan people as refugees. Pardon me. And they were told that they would not be allowed to go to Australia. Every other country is saying, you've got to be kidding. These people are Australia's little thing to deal with. And so for want of anywhere else to go, they looked like having to spend an indefinite time living in the community on Nauru. The problem is the Nauruan locals, just like the Manus Island locals, hate the refugees. They really hate them. They have attacked them, they've sexually abused them, and so on and so forth. So Omid Masumali, desperate at the idea that they may have to spend an indefinite number of years living in the community on Nauru, went into a public place, doused himself in petrol, and set himself alight. And he died. It was a terrible episode. But Cathy Wilcox did a cartoon in the paper the next day. It's a man engulfed in flames. And the caption simply reads, "Not drowning." When you think about the drownings excuse, think about this. If people, we know seeking asylum is dangerous. All of history tells us that seeking asylum is dangerous. So if they do not head towards Australia and run the risk of drowning, if instead, what are their alternatives? I suppose they could go north and cross the Mediterranean. Well, we know people have drowned in the Mediterranean in large numbers. Or they could stand their ground and face their persecutors. But if they do that and they're killed there, they're still dead, just as if they drowned. Difference? We don't know about it. If they go north and cross the Mediterranean and drown, they're still dead, just as if they drowned on the way to Australia, but we won't know about it. The drowning excuse is nothing more or less than us keeping our conscience clear, because we do not want to know what is happening to people whose circumstances are so desperate that if we were in their shoes, we would do the same as they do. Here's an interesting way of testing this. I want you to imagine for a moment that you're one of the two most recognised groups of refugees, a Hazara from Afghanistan or a Rohingyan from Burma. These people, it's a no-brainer. I mean, like, if you said, I'm a Jew, I've come from Germany, it's 1938, are you a refugee? Well, probably yes. Okay, so that's the same odds. 99% of Afghan Hazaras who've reached Australia have been assessed by us as refugees entitled to protection. Okay, so I want you to imagine for a moment, you're a Rohingya Burmese or you're an Afghan Hazara. You've seen your relatives killed, you've seen your friends taken off the bus by the Taliban and slaughtered and left beside the road. You've seen the children who have lost one or both legs because they've been used as human minesweepers by the Taliban. All of these things are common stuff in Afghanistan, and Afghan Hazaras have suffered appallingly as a consequence. So you've stuck it out as long as you can, and eventually it's just getting too rough. You make a run for it. And instead of going north, you head south. You don't pass through any country which has signed the Refugees Convention between there and Indonesia. Indonesia hasn't signed the convention either. You can enter Indonesia easily. You get a visa on arrival, 1 month. At the end of 1 month, if you are found, you'll be thrown in jail. If you've got children, you can't send them to school because you'll be found, you'll be thrown in jail. You can't get a job because if you do, you'll be found, you'll be thrown in jail. Now, you've got two choices. You can either, well, three I suppose. You could go back and face the Taliban again, but you probably won't do that. Or you can hang around in the shadows for as long as it takes for a country to resettle you. On current indications, that might be 1, 2, 3 decades. Or you can take your courage in both hands and use a people smuggler and get on a boat and head towards Australia, which is the first country that signed the Refugees Convention in the trip that you've taken from Afghanistan through Pakistan, through India, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Okay, is there anyone in the room who won't use a people smuggler and get on a boat? Anyone at all? Okay, so what are we doing when we punish people for doing exactly what we would do if we had the misfortune to be in their shoes? What do we think we're doing? No family reunion. Manus Island, now there's a thing. Manus Island has seen some appalling events. Some of you will remember the name of Reza Barati. Anyone remember Reza Barati? Okay. Reza Barati was from Iran, yeah. And he was banged up in Manus. He was killed. Scott Morrison, who is the most dishonest, hypocritical parliamentarian we've got, although Peter Dutton gives him a run for his money. On the other hand, Peter Dutton may be too stupid to be hypocritical, but... Scott Morrison went public and said that Reza Barati had escaped from the Manus Island detention centre and had been killed outside the centre by locals. Plausible enough, because the locals don't like the refugees. But very quickly, soon afterwards, a few of us received sworn eyewitness statements, the most notable of them from a man called Behnam Sattar. Behnam Sattar shared the same room as Reza Barati. Behnam Sattar's eyewitness statement, signed by him, says that he saw Reza Barati running across the compound trying to get back to their room where he could be safe. He was approached by a guard named, who's holding a long piece of timber with 2 long nails driven through the far end. The guard swung it at him twice, hit him on the head twice. Reza Barati fell to the ground bleeding profusely from the scalp. He was then surrounded by 10 guards, paid by Australia, remember, 10 guards who took it in turns to kick him in the torso and in the head. And then another person on the Australian payroll, named, came along with a large rock and brought it crashing down on Reza Barati's head. And according to Behnam Sattar's statement, he said, "That killed him. I knew it killed him because the next time one of the guards kicked him, he didn't flinch." Okay, so he sends this sworn eyewitness statement to a few of us. He and his friend, who'd also written an eyewitness statement, were then taken in by Wilson Security. Wilson Security, who guard your public parks. Wilson Security, incorporated in Panama to avoid the inconvenience of paying tax on the money that your government is paying them. Wilson Security took Benham Sattar and his friend into their cabin and tied them to chairs and beat them up. And they said, if you don't withdraw your statement, we will take you outside the camp where you'll be publicly raped by locals. That's Wilson Security in action for you. Now, I'm a lawyer and I'm not allowed to advise unlawful conduct, but it strikes me as an entertaining idea for someone to get some self-adhesive stickers made reading Wilson Security, Nauru, Manus, Panama, and stick them across those signs on the public parks where they take your tax dollars in order to guard the parks, just like they take your tax dollars to guard people on Manus and Nauru. But of course, you shouldn't do it because it would be unlawful in some way. But if you do it, I'll smile. Can we edit that bit up? The other thing you need to know about Manus and Nauru is how ferociously expensive it is. It is costing Australian taxpayers roughly $570,000 per refugee per year to keep them locked up offshore. And it's an interesting thing. I worked out that we could have, and this would be appalling policy, and I'm not advocating this policy, but it's an interesting bit of arithmetic. If when all of the people who are presently on Nauru and Manus, if when they arrived at Christmas Island, we'd handed them $1 million in cash each and said, piss off and find some country that wants you, we would have saved billions of dollars. That's insane. That is really genuinely insane. There is another way of doing this, by the way. There's another way of doing it. If anyone ever asks you, well, you know, okay, you've heard Burnside carrying on about this, so what would you do? Well, here's an idea. Let's, first of all, we've got to accept the judgment of the world community, including Donald Trump, by the way, who says, why don't you just let him out of prison? Huh? Good question. Probably the only good thought he's had. I would say offshore processing is outrageous. It's ferociously expensive, it's cruel. Most of the people there have been there for 4 years in conditions which are just hellish. So, bring them all on shore, bring them all into Australia. If they've been assessed as refugees, give them protection or reassess them, doesn't matter. Just get them out of the hell we put them in. And then accept as a possibility at least that the boats will start coming again. Now, it's not a certainty because we've put a ring of steel around the edge of the moat, so maybe they wouldn't get through. But let's assume that boats do start coming again. Then, because I don't advocate open borders, despite what some of my critics say, I would say, okay, if they arrive without a visa, put them in detention, but limit the detention to 1 month. Use that month for preliminary health and security checks. And at the end of 1 month, release them into the community on a visa which requires them to stay in regular, like every week, contact with the Department of Immigration. Maybe by checking into a post office or something federal government, they've got to keep in regular contact so they can't just disappear. Second, they're allowed to work, basic to human dignity. Third, they're allowed access to Medicare and Centrelink benefits. Fourth, crucially, until their refugee status is finally decided, they must live in a specified regional town or city. Not in the coastal capitals, in a regional town or city. Now, how does this play out? First of all, you have to make some assumptions. Let's assume that the boats do start arriving again and that the arrival rate stabilises at the highest ever arrival rate since white settlement, which was 25,000 in 1 year. That was in 2012. 25,000 boat people arrived in 2012 seeking asylum. So let's assume that becomes the new normal. Incredibly unlikely, but let's assume it. Let's assume every single one of them remains on full Centrelink benefits. Also incredibly unlikely, because these are highly motivated people who really do want to create a new life in a safe place. If we did that, if you accept both of those assumptions, it would cost the federal economy $500 million a year. But given that, you know, Centrelink benefits don't leave you much left over once you've paid rent and food and a bit of clothing, all of that money will be spent in the economy of regional towns and cities, which would be very good for them. I'd highly recommend it for Bunbury, which is my first visit to Bunbury. I like Bunbury, it's great. Or Margaret River. So we would stop torturing them, we would start treating them decently, and we would help the regional economy, and we would save billions of dollars. We're spending round about $2,000 or $3,000 million every year keeping them offshore. For $500 million a year, we could actually treat them decently. Well, I think it's a no-brainer. But then, when you've got a parliament full of no-brains, there's an interesting thing about that. I was taken to Jordan in May this year. Jordan is interesting geographically because it's got Israel on the west, Iraq on the east, and Syria on the north. They get quite a few refugees. Now, they don't have rivers at their borders, so the people can just walk across. They're shoe people, not boat people. And in the 12 or 18 months up to the time that I was there, they had received 1 million informal refugees walking across the border from Syria. People asking for protection in circumstances that are so obvious that you hardly need to think about it. All of those people are allowed to live in the community. They're not locked up. They're allowed to live in the community. We haven't received 1 million informal refugees since the time we signed the Refugees Convention 60-something years ago. Okay? Jordan hasn't even signed the Refugees Convention, and they're doing far better than we have ever done. And Jordan has a population of, 9.5 million, no great natural resources, it's not a rich country, but they are doing far better than we are. So, how are we doing? Not well. Interestingly, one of the places I spent a couple of days at when I was in Jordan was a camp called Al-Zatari. Up in the north, it's about 4 kilometres south of the Syrian border. And there's it's a refugee camp, it's not a detention centre, it's a place where refugees can stay and make their way. If they get jobs outside the camp, they leave each day and come back each day, and it's just a convenient place for them to live if they wish. The Al-Zatari camp is a model of how people could be treated if we acted like human beings. It's the main street. There are 80,000 refugees living in Al-Zatari camp at the moment, and there's lots of sort of roadways, streets, not paved, but they're streets. The main one is called the Champs-Élysées. In the Al-Zatari camp, there are 2,000 shops set up by refugees, run by refugees, including 2 shops where you can hire bridal gowns. How about that? I mean, this is a place, Jordan is a country where refugees are given a sense of hope for the future. Australia, unfortunately, is a country where refugees are given nothing but despair about the future, and we drive them to madness. It's very sad. Let me just... I have to watch that. Oh, God, I've been carrying on. Sorry. I brought along with me a really important document called Form 1281. And I'm sure you all know why it's important. It's the Department of Immigration and Border Protection Australian Values Statement, Form 1281. This statement must be signed by the main applicant and each person aged 18 years or over who is included in the visa application, unless blah, blah, blah. I confirm that I have read or had explained to me information provided by the Australian Government on Australian society and values. I understand, first bullet point, Australian society values respect for the freedom and dignity of the individual. Really? Okay. Blah, blah, blah. And a spirit of egalitarianism that embraces mutual respect, tolerance, fair play and compassion for those in need. This is Peter Dutton's work. I mean, really, that in itself is shameful enough. how can we be so hypocritical as to say, these are our values, now we'll punish you because you come from somewhere else? I actually think that is a fair statement of Australian values. Unfortunately, the public have been persuaded to think that mistreating boat people is okay because, after all, they are criminals. But they're not. You know, we call them illegals, we call the exercise border protection, so the public at large think we're being protected from criminals. If it was true, it would make sense. A bit over the top, but it would make sense. But it's not true. And once you realise it's not true, suddenly you understand the shock of recognising that we are behaving in a way which may redefine what this country is about. That statement of Australian values, I would like to see every member of the Federal Parliament put their hand on their heart and recite those values, because what we're doing is so alien to those values that you could fairly say we are no longer the country we thought we were. And that is why you should care for refugees. Thank you.